Welcome to the ESRC Festival of Social Science. Thank you very much for joining us today. My name is James Brown. I work at the Warwick Institute of Engagement, and it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker for today's session on rescuing a sick labour market. Before I introduce our speaker for today, though, I just want to flag up that we've got lots of other events happening all week. You can see all the Warwick events at warwick.ac.uk/ESRC FOSS, Festival of Social Science. And from that website, you'll be able to click through to the main festival site as well. There's over 100 events going on throughout the week, so do have a look and make sure you register to plenty of other events as well. You can also follow us on Twitter at Warwick Engages and use the hashtag ESRC Festival as well. So do sort of tweet and ask questions and do all sorts there. In terms of questions, we do want your questions. We do want you to get involved. So you can use the chat box down the side of the YouTube video to ask questions. So please do put in your questions and let us know where you're joining us from as well. We know we've got a nice global audience out there. So please do let us know where you're joining from. If you're watching this through the Eventbrite link, you might need to click through to the YouTube video to be able to see the chat box, but then you should be able to contribute there as well. So it is my great pleasure to introduce Professor Mirko Draca, who is in the Department of Economics at the University of Warwick. So I'll hand over to Mirko and you can take it from here.
Okay, thanks a lot, James. Okay, and okay, so thanks very much for coming to this presentation, this virtual presentation. So this is Rescuing a Sick Labour Market, Economic Impacts of COVID-19. Today, Emma Duccini and Julia Vattuone at the Economics Department at Warwick University, we've prepared this work. This is part of a work in service of a UKRI Rapid Response COVID research grant that we've received in conjunction with Roland Rathlow at Warwick University and Arthur Turrell at the Bank of England. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank the ESRC for this funding. And in particular, I think the ESRC did a remarkable job of essentially compressing the application period for this grant and was able to get money out to researchers in about kind of 8 weeks from application point until kind of the actual delivery of the grant funding. And I think this should be clearly acknowledged in terms of the ESRC's great work, organizational work in getting funding out to researchers. Okay, so I think it's quite suffice to say that we are undergoing sort of strange days in terms of the operation of the economy, right? So this is a simulation from the National Institute of Economic and Social Research's sort of macro model, looking at the path of GDP over time, right? And in particular, doing a kind of simulation of the path of GDP by their macroeconomic model. And kind of what's interesting, in terms of the strange days or strange times that we're undergoing is this sort of massive contraction in GDP, like a 25% contraction in GDP earlier in the year. And then in terms of NICE's kind of scenario modeling of a second lockdown, a further 10% contraction in GDP, in such a way that what's effectively happened is that kind of the COVID-19 has carved a W shape into the path of GDP over time, right? So, this is already suggesting to us, how kind of this COVID-19 kind of induced economic shock is different to previous crises, okay? In the usual recession, economic activity slows down continuously as firms respond to negative shocks. In the case of COVID-19, what we've seen is a discrete immediate shutdown of entire sectors, followed by a significant reversion of economic activity. We can see examples of this just by looking at job vacancy activity. So this is kind of job vacancy activity taken from online job ads, the Burning Glass Technologies database, and I'll talk about in more detail later on in the presentation. And kind of what this is showing you is this kind of massive contraction in the number of job vacancies in the economy across different occupational groups of up to about 70%. at the depth of the kind of COVID-19 retraction, and then this kind of similar kind of reversion of economic activities such that sort of we've got some occupations back to their kind of pre-COVID levels. And, this kind of links into this kind of rapid contraction and reversion process, links into the whole policy framework that's been developed around COVID-19, which you can kind of refer to as a sort of pandemic Keynesianism. And here, kind of the main policy response that we've seen is a response that's designed to support incomes via policy mechanisms such as the furlough scheme, and they're designed in this way to avoid what you would think of as a catastrophic cascading collapse of demand, right? And so this is the process whereby we would see kind of workers in one sector lose their job, those workers stop spending, and then other workers in kind of sectors dependent on that spending eventually lose their jobs. So instead, what we've had here is kind of a classic Keynesian response where we've implemented payments such as those through the furlough as a kind of fiscal stabilizer to kind of prevent this catastrophic cascading collapse of demand. Another principle of this sort of pandemic Keynesianism that I think we've seen in the last kind of 6 to 9 months is this kind of principle that what we're dealing with here is to a large extent a temporary shock, and what we want to do is maximize economic continuity with the order that we had prior to March 2020. In turn, I think what we've effectively sort of got here is an economic policy that looks a lot like this, right? So this is kind of a clip of the kind of suspended animation technology in the kind of Nostromo spaceship in Alien, right? Where they kind of put their crew to sleep for a period of months as they kind of travel through space. And effectively what we've, I think, one metaphor here for our current economy, and in particular policies like the job retention scheme, the furlough, is this idea of suspended animation, of freezing the economy into place and then kind of reviving the economy later on as, when we think it's safe and when we think kind of demand conditions are sufficient. So what we've got and what I'll be discussing is this sort of idea of a suspended animation labour market, right? A kind of key goal of the JRS, the job retention scheme, was to keep employees attached to their previous employer, right? And kind of we've got this goal because we understand that it's hard for people to re-enter the labour market if they fall out of the labour market, right? And we're fortunate that the pandemic came along at a time when the labour market was relatively benign, right, and arguably at a peak, and therefore neat continuity with the old order is something that we think of as pretty desirable. And kind of in terms of general principles of this suspended animation labour market, what we've got is a classic kind of case of making this distinction between temporary and permanent shocks. That is, the big challenge of the COVID-19 shock for policy is figuring out how much of the shock is temporary and how much of it is permanent. In the middle, what we're going to have is a persistent component in the midst of the temporary and permanent components that's mainly going to be manifested in the form of higher unemployment, right? And we can think of this permanent effect, and then kind of in addition to that, we can think of the permanent bit as manifesting in long-run structural change to our economy and long-run structural change to the composition of employment. So first, in terms of understanding this sick labour market and sick economy, let's look at the temporary part, where I think there's actually been a lot of success. And kind of a key policy here that is sort of indicative of lots of the different policies that the government have implemented is the JRS, the Job Retention Scheme, right? So you'll surely have heard of this. At its nub, this is a policy that allows employers to claim about 80% of their employees' wages of up to £2,500 a month. It was initially introduced for 3 months and it extended until the end of October, now extended until March 2021. Current estimates by the OBR up until July 2020 put the gross cost at about $63 billion. The first extension allowed for a partial furlough, and the latest data indicates that kind of partially furloughed workers represent about 30% of total furloughed workers. At its peak earlier in the year, the JRS covered about 8.9 million workers. So this is kind of from ONS and HMRC administrative data showing you the scale of the JRS and sort of the reduction of kind of JRS workers over time. So we're hitting kind of a peak of 8 to 9 million around May 2020. The best estimate I could come to in terms of the size of the employed labour force in the UK was at about 27.5 million for the employed labour force and 4.7 million for the self-employed. What this means is that at the peak of the JRS, we had approximately 32% of employees on furlough. This has gone down to kind of the latest data from around kind of September 2020 to about 14.5%. As we'd expect, right, the sectoral impact of the JRS in terms of where these furloughed workers are located is in sectors like kind of wholesale and retail and accommodation and food services. These top 4 sectors supported by the JRS kind of account for 57.5% of total workers on the JRS. In addition to this, there's about six other sectors that can be shown. We've got about 200,000 to 300,000 workers still on furlough in sectors such as the arts and professional occupations, right? So I think kind of, the important thing to see here is that we still have a massive number of workers on furlough of about 3 million workers in furlough. And we've got sectors such as sort of arts and accommodation and food services, which have got kind of a very large fraction of their workers still on the JRS. But notably, we've had this sort of kind of fairly large reductions from the peak of the JRS over the last few months. So has the JRS been successful, right? Arguably, I would say yes. HMRC data tracking JRS workers indicates that 90% of those who left the furlough or kind of were no longer supported by the furlough are still working with their same employer. So this is kind of the suspended animation effect that I just discussed, working, right? That we froze those workers in place with the JRS and then kind of revived them into the same position in the labour market that they had before March 2020. A Resolution Foundation YouGov survey sort of gives slightly different numbers. They indicate about 74% of furlough workers are with the same employer, with about 10% moving to a new employer. And there's a kind of a comparison that we have to do here in terms of workers who are on JRS versus workers in other parts of the labour market who weren't on JRS. And what we see there is that there's still kind of a higher level of what you would think of as leakage, right? Of you've got this leakage of 9% of workers leak out from their current employers into other states in the labour market from the JRS relative to 5% for non-JRS workers. And this kind of process of leakage of kind of workers exiting their current employers after the end of their furlough period is what we expect to contribute to kind of unemployment in the medium and long term. And currently what we've got is some sort of varying estimates of kind of the probable extent of unemployment that we're going to see over the next few years. This is showing unemployment going back to the 1970s. What is expected over the next couple of years is an unemployment peak that will be at least comparable to the levels of unemployment we saw during the financial crisis in the late 2000s and the early 2010s. And you've got potential OBR scenarios hitting levels of unemployment, in excess of 10% up to the 12% peaks that we saw in the recessions of the 80s and the early 1990s. So far, the situation has been kind of relatively good in that we've seen a limited increase of unemployment from 4.1 to 4.5% in the 3 months to August, which is still the largest change we've seen in the quarterly period since the financial crisis. And we are seeing sort of significant buildups of regional or area level unemployment. So the claimant count has hit rates of about 9.5% for cities such as Birmingham, Hull and Blackpool, from pre-lockdown rates of about 5.5%. And kind of as we saw before, the Bank of England and the OBR are projecting levels of unemployment of about 7.5% or potentially 11.9% by the end of 2020, right? And I think the big question that we have to think about here in terms of this idea of rescuing a sick labour market is where exactly is this unemployment coming from? And I think here a good indicator is what we would think of as a flows approach to the labour market, right? So, we've got about 27.5 million employees in the labour market in kind of any given month. And then every month we're seeing about 500 to 700,000 inflows and outflows to and from PAYE status, right? So this is what we think of as the labour market churn of people changing jobs. And the netted difference between these inflows and outflows is what gives us flows into non-employment states such as unemployment and activity. And what we see in some of the administrative data that HMRC has been releasing is a burst of outflows and then a deep freeze of both inflows and outflows. So this is data from the ONS HMRC kind of real-time information statistics. So this is essentially taken off of the HMRC's PAYE information. And this is kind of giving you these kind of inflows and outflows of employees from PAYE status at given employers over time, right? And so what this is effectively saying is that in any given month, we've got about kind of 600,000 employees kind of moving out of a particular, employment with a particular employer, and then another kind of 600,000 employees, not necessarily exactly the same employees, kind of moving into employment with a particular PAYE employer, right? And then as we see the COVID-19 shock hit, what we see is this kind of massive burst of employee outflows of kind of workers presumably taking redundancies, exiting employment with a particular employer, and this deep freeze of inflows, right? So what we've got here is kind of a job destruction effect in terms of these kind of red bars, but actually quite a considerable kind of slow job creation effect, right? And so what this means is that a big segment of the unemployment that we're seeing in the moment is actually due to the slowdown of job creation, right? And people who are out of the labour market kind of lacking the opportunities to kind of find new employment. So, what we're likely to see over time in the next few months, therefore, is inflows are likely to be stunted, and kind of more kind of importantly, we're likely to see inflows undergo a certain degree of change in composition, structural change. And this is kind of where our new research comes in, using vacancies data. So as part of our work on this research grant, we're using data from Burning Glass Technologies, which is sort of a labour market analytics or information company which sort of collects millions of information on millions of vacancies across different across kind of different websites. For the UK, what we're working with here is about 50 million vacancies since 2012. In line with the inflows data that I just showed you, there was a collapse in vacancies over the 2020 period, right? So this is kind of showing you a smoothed 42-day average of the number of kind of deduplicated unique vacancies reported in the Burning Glass data over time, right? And so this is showing you the big collapse of vacancies. So what we've got here is in kind of the normal period where you've got about 23 to 25,000 vacancies per year, per day rather. This lines up with the kind of 600,000 kind of inflows and outflows that we saw in the previous graph, right? And so we're seeing this massive collapse in vacancies in line with the inflows data that we saw before. In terms of the regional distribution of this, we're seeing kind of quite a wide range of impacts in terms of this vacancy collapse across regions, from fairly kind of small number of areas with fairly trivial reductions in the number of vacancies of the order of about kind of 0 to 20% to kind of fairly big reductions in vacancies of over 60%, up to 80%. What we've basically found in terms of, the kind of correlates of this kind of regional impact is that the share of non-essential or non-key workers, right, essentially, which is effectively like a big bunch of public sector workers plus retail supermarket workers, that tends to explain the kind of the regional distribution of the vacancy collapse at the kind of the peak or the depth of the COVID-19 shock. Kind of more interesting in terms of the long-run implications of the COVID-19 shock is the compositional change that we can pick up in vacancies via the disaggregated kind of occupational information in the burning glass data. So this is going to allow us to look at the change in vacancies by SOC 2 occupation and see where jobs are still being created, right? So in this kind of next set of slides that I'm going to show you, we're going to look at the February to May change in vacancies, which sort of reflects the maximum depth of the shock, so where the kind of maximum damage was inflicted in the economy. And then we're going to look at the February to October change, which was a period where kind of activity was relatively normal, okay, for 2020 at least, and JRS numbers were falling rapidly, which gives us an indication of kind of where demand might be coming back. Okay, so this is sort of the depth of the change, right? So this is the kind of maximum shock, or where the maximum damage was inflicted to labour demand. And so here you're seeing sort of what you would intuitively expect. So down the bottom here, what we've actually got is this category, textiles, printing and skilled trades, is actually driven by hospitality, right? So hospitality as a skilled trade is located within this SOC occupational code. And then in terms of the occupations that were maximally affected by the pandemic shock, what we've got is an interesting mix of what we'd expect in terms of sales occupations in areas like retail, and then a lot of kind of business administrative or business support occupations in terms of secretarial occupations, and then big business and public service associate professionals and administrative occupations, right? And then in terms of the occupations least affected, we're seeing kind of, again, what people would intuitively expect is that, demand for the health occupations and caring occupations was sustained even at the very depth of the pandemic shock. Now looking at kind of what we would think of as the early recovery period, this is sort of giving us the earliest indication that we can get of kind of what labour demand is likely to look like in terms of vacancies over the remainder of 2020 and going into 2021, right? And so what we've got here is kind of the same sorts of occupations are still suffering sort of, reductions of vacancies relative to the kind of pre-COVID period of about kind of 20 to 30%. So we've got kind of the hospitality sector, and then these kind of office, medium skill office and administrative occupations. And then kind of bringing up where kind of vacancies are actually growing relative to the kind of pre-COVID levels. What we've got is essentially a recovery of the building industry or the construction industry, which has sort of, to a large extent, become what we think of as COVID safe, right? And then we've got an interesting category here, which is sort of transport and machine drivers, right? And so looking into this category, we can see sort of the first signs of structural change in the economy. So I call this kind of, we're living in Jeff Bezos's world now. So this is giving you the time series of the number of vacancies in the kind of van driving SOC 3 over time. So what we're seeing here is an expansion of kind of van drivers, effectively the delivery sector, over different kind of all these years since 2014, along with these kind of seasonal variations leading up to Christmas. And then we're seeing kind of in the post-pandemic period, a collapse that's similar to kind of other occupations, and then this massive expansion to about kind of 10,000 vacancies kind of per day in the most recent period, right? So this is the kind of first indication that we've got of this kind of systematic kind of structural change affecting the composition of vacancies. And so this kind of leads to other sort of considerations about kind of structural change, right? So, and I sort of think of this as the SOS Save Our Sandwiches. And kind of in terms of what we've just seen in terms of this kind of change in the composition of kind of labour demand, I think what's gone unnoticed or relatively unnoticed in the public debate is this collapse of demand for office occupations relative to the obvious categories of hospitality and face-to-face retail, right? In part, this sort of, ongoing, reduced demand or collapse in demand for office occupations is going to be a consequence of the slow withdrawal from remote working or working from home that we've seen on the part of UK workers relative to, say, workers on the continent. But I think an issue that we have to look at here in terms of even the short run future of 2021 is that the underlying conditions exist here for a consolidation of medium skilled office-based employment. And the first sort of indicators of this can be found in the increase in the instance of remote working that we're seeing. Okay, so this is kind of data we've kind of extracted from our kind of vacancies data. So what we've done here is essentially looked at the text of job vacancies and sort of extracted these indicators for different types of remote working, of home working, mobile working, and teleworking, right? So this is just literally where these terms appear in the text of the job ads, right? And what we're seeing here is this kind of doubling of the fraction of job ads featuring this information or kind of potential opportunities for remote working, and it's concentrated in the kinds of occupations that we'd expect. And in terms of how we're thinking about this data, we think that this is likely to be an underestimate of the total fraction of the increase in remote working over time, because we've kind of taken a conservative approach to defining, the types of words that we think of as signaling remote working. And we think that potentially, a lot of remote working, it may be the case that remote working is becoming an assumed part of the offer of different types of jobs in the economy. And in terms of what we're seeing, the composition of remote working, it's occurring in the types of occupations that we expect, such as kind of professional occupations, sales and customer service occupations related to essentially phone type sales, and then kind of managerial and associate professional type work that can be done from home. One consequence of this is also that, one kind of stylized fact that we're starting to see in the data is that this sort of retrenchment in the kind of the demand for office work, or this clear kind of reduction in what we think of as the composition of vacancies in terms of office work, is starting to manifest itself in kind of regional differences. So this is a plot of daily total vacancies for London versus the home counties. And what we're seeing here, if you look at this pink line, right, is that kind of London's kind of recovery sags relative to the home counties over time, such that it's essentially kind of the bottom of the league table of London versus the home counties in terms of, it's got about, a 10 to 15% lower level of kind of vacancy recovery relative to the top home counties over time. And this is likely to be a consequence of this collapse in demand for office vacancies, and as well the collapse in demand for retail and hospitality vacancies. Okay, so that's sort of what's happening in terms of labour demand. Kind of a more immediate concern in terms of what we're undergoing now in terms of November 2020 is what I think of as a stop-go labour market, right? And kind of the implementation of this sort of second major kind of national lockdown. And so a big concern here is that we want to know what is the direct effect of lockdown policy on labour market conditions. In particular, this is important to know because the most likely bet is that we're going to see tiered regional policies to continue in place during 2021, even if the current lockdowns, England lockdown is lifted in early December. The early autumn and in some cases kind of summer regional lockdowns that we saw indicate that the vacancy effects of lockdowns might be contained to subsectors, right? So this is sort of a plot we did of different counties across the UK, and what we're looking at here in particular is trying to see whether kind of there's any obvious effect of the kind of one of the earliest lockdowns, which is the Leicester lockdown, which we tried to kind of mark out here in sort of a bright thick red, right? And so here, what you're essentially seeing is that, there doesn't seem to be any kind of clear deviation of kind of Leicester's level of vacancies relative to other groups over the period of its kind of summer lockdown. This is the total vacancies. If we look at kind of vacancies in hospitality, we are starting to see some sort of deviation of Leicester's total vacancies in hospitality from other comparable counties, in particular from Coventry here. Another area which was hit by a regional lockdown was Aberdeen, right, which is also seeing kind of flatlining of hospitality vacancies. This is sort of an area of ongoing research by our team, right? And so the idea here will be to sort of, find the ideal sorts of comparison counties so that we can sort of, measure before and after effects of these lockdowns. So far, just from what we would call eyeballing the data, we're seeing no big effects on kind of the aggregate level of vacancies and some possible effects at the level of particular sectors, which are the focus of these sorts of regional tiered lockdowns. So this kind of raises a bigger policy issue that's been discussed in the last couple of weeks, in particular of this lockdowns versus livelihoods trade-off, right? From what we've been looking at in the data, it does look like there could be a zone where the economic effects of social distancing can be minimized in terms of total vacancies, right? Insofar that we can think that these regional lockdowns, fortunately, are only hitting kind of subsectors where we'd expect them to be kind of hitting vacancies, but not having these kind of spillover effects to other sectors. The other side of this kind of tricky issue of designing lockdowns that minimize economic effects is sort of maximizing effects in terms of reducing COVID-19 incidence, right? And so, that's still an open question, that is to what extent local lockdowns are actually affecting COVID-19 cases. One big issue here in terms of thinking about this lockdown versus livelihood trade-off is this idea of the fear of the virus. That is, you can lift lockdowns, but because kind of the population still have some hesitation of fear of the virus, social consumption, that is kind of, purchases in retail, kind of patronage of hospitality isn't necessarily going to recover, right? So far, it's not obvious that there's a strong fear of the virus factor driving social consumption. Here, there's been some interesting work by a team, Davenport et al., a team at the Institute for Fiscal Studies, where they looked into bank account data, where it wasn't necessarily clear that kind of levels of COVID incidence in a particular area necessarily feed to kind of different levels of kind of social consumption, right? But that's sort of still a kind of open question to what extent there is this fear of the virus effect. We think that the current shortfall that we're seeing in social consumption, right, in kind of which we can kind of measure in terms of vacancies in the hospitality sector, is going to be basically a function of three different things. So firstly, the fear of the virus factor. Secondly, what you would think of as persistent behavioural changes in consumption patterns. That is, people just get out of the habit of shopping in face-to-face retail, or get out of the habit of patronising restaurants and pubs, right? And then thirdly, what we're obviously going to start seeing, or we should be seeing at the moment, is income effects of the COVID-19 economic shock. That is, newly unemployed workers, or let's say self-employed workers who've taken an income hit, will just be spending less because they have less to spend, right? And this sort of points to the need, as we kind of end 2020 and go into 2021, for sort of real-time evaluation using kind of real-time economic data of measuring these different components of what's driving the lockdown livelihoods trade-off. So in terms of where to, right? So like what we need in terms of, this idea of, rescuing this sick labour market. I think the main priority at the moment of what we need is a clear signal of where we'll be in spring 2021, right? So that kind of the private sector in particular can sort of forecast demand and make decisions about reopening businesses. And here, what I think we need is kind of clear statements from the government in terms of what they're actually aiming for. So, is the government aiming for full suppression of COVID-19, or is it aiming for some type of curve flattening, right? What does the government think is an acceptable level of excess deaths, right? Are we looking to fully suppress excess deaths, or are we looking to keep excess deaths within one standard deviation of historical average? What band of R value is actually being targeted, and how is R being measured, right? And so I think sort of a clearer signal from the government in terms of what it thinks of as these sort of, to use the jargon, key performance indicators would be very helpful in terms of establishing some expectations on the part of business in terms of what they can bank on in terms of opening up their businesses again. Here, what I'd recommend sort of interested listeners or viewers look at is a recent public lecture by Gus O'Donnell, former head of the civil service, where he sort of talked about the need to integrate health objectives with social and economic objectives. And in particular, the need to sort of set up a kind of meta committee of expertise on top of kind of scientific public health expertise that's specifically designed to sort of integrate social and economic objectives with kind of national health objectives, right? And that's kind of a lecture, a very good lecture that I strongly recommend you look at. Okay, so in terms of closing up, in terms of the long-term implications of COVID-19 and what we're dealing with in particular during 2021, I think a useful talking point here is a kind of recent editorial leader from The Economist, right? And so here The Economist is talking about the zombification, the potential zombification of the economy in the face of policies such as the job retention scheme. And here they sort of, in their own colourful economist way, they talk about this idea of, imagine if 20 years ago the British government had vowed to protect every job in the country. Today we'd have an extra 30,000 Britons working as high street travel agents, or fax machine repairers, or stacking shelves in sort of redundant kind of supermarket chains. And essentially what The Economist here is doing is making this call for a COVID creative destruction process of allowing obsolete jobs to wither and new jobs to blossom, as being one of the main ways in which capitalist economies get richer and more productive, right? So in terms of how should we think about this in terms of kind of impeding this process of reallocation in the economy, I think that this idea of creatively destroying the 2 to 3 million jobs that we still have being supported by JRS is a big call to make, right? So if you kind of go back to one of those earliest figures I showed you, we've got about 2 to 3 million jobs supported by JRS. That's likely to go up with this second lockdown. What I think is needed here is a clear government strategy on what it means in terms of suppression policy for 2021, right? For example, what is the likelihood of another, let's say, spring lockdown in March or April, right? Which is a perfectly realistic scenario in terms of the fact that we first saw COVID take off in March or April of this year. And I think that's needed before we make any decisions about withdrawing the JRS for these 2 to 3 million workers still on JRS and kind of unleashing them to these forces of kind of creative destruction. That is to say, at the moment, demand conditions are still too flaky. And what we actually see in the data is that the economy has come back in terms of typical levels of inflows and outflows of about 600,000 workers per month in terms of inflows and outflows. So there is reallocation, there is creative destruction still going on in the economy. But I think here, another big strand of that Economist leader article is sort of spot on, right? And that is, encouraging the general idea of strong income support, occurring through 2021. That is kind of high levels, higher than average levels of universal credit, for example, and also programs encouraging entrepreneurship and reallocation from 2021 onwards. And here, what I think we're going to see is essentially the debate about economic policy next year will be this sort of more politically pointed debate about kind of phase 2 pandemic Keynesianism. That is, how much stimulus are we going to need next year to support this process of reallocation in the economy? And in particular, I think a big important new focus that we're going to see next year as unemployment rises is, what's going to be the nature of this new pool of unemployed workers. I think this has got the potential to be a new type of displaced worker. So in previous recessions, displaced workers have been dominated by essentially kind of manual male, like low skill workers in manufacturing or other kind of manual industries. In this kind of 2021 period, what we're likely to see is a wave of kind of displaced workers in sectors like kind of medium skill office administrative work, in sectors like kind of hospitality and retail, right? And we need to think about how we're going to support this kind of reallocation process in terms of this new pool of displaced workers. So I think I'll leave it at that. So James, I think.
Hello. Yes. Thank you. That was fascinating. That was really interesting. If you've got questions for us in the audience, please do put them in the YouTube chat. But I'll start us off. Is this an entirely sort of novel situation, or can we sort of look back at other situations when we see sort of similar patterns, or is this completely sort of different to anything we've seen before?
I think it's completely different, right? So we've never seen, maybe in periods like the Great Depression, the kind of contraction in GDP that we saw early in the year, and then the reversion, right? So this idea of it comes down to the fact that we have this kind of intrinsically temporary shock. The core of this is an intrinsically temporary shock, whereas what we've had in previous recessions is sort of these endemic problems build up in the economy, right? We have a financial sector that builds up sort of endemic financial fragility, right? Or we have a productivity slowdown in manufacturing, which is arguably kind of underpinned the early 80s and early 90s recessions, right? So this is indeed, I think, a completely different type of shock. And what I found interesting, kind of surveying all of the policies that have been implemented since the start of this year, was this sort of universal embrace of incredibly Keynesian interventionist policies, right? So you've got the JRS, but then you've got kind of an accompanying self-employment scheme. You've got a scheme to support venture capital firms of about £500 million at least. You've got a scheme to support arts organisations. You've got increases in income support through the welfare system. So it's a unique economic shock, and it's got a uniquely scaled kind of policy response.
Mm. And you had that quote from The Economist, which when you see it written down looks very shocking, doesn't it? Talking about obsolete jobs and this sort of support. How do we ensure that there are certain sectors there which we want to keep? Things like the arts sector and cinemas and things which I feel that there's a lot of talk around them being a serious risk, and they are going to sort of vanish and we are going to lose those. How do we ensure that we sort of keep those bits that we want to have around in the next few years?
Okay, so one thing there is that the government has started to put in place, like what's amazing is just the plethora of policy measures that the government has introduced, right? And I think the Treasury and other kind of government departments deserve some credit there. So for arts organisations, there actually is an arts recovery scheme. So in my email over the last few weeks, I've been receiving kind of I'm on the newsletters for like kind of lots of theatres and halls and kind of weird arts organisations who are kind of talking about how they need support, right, from punters, general punters, but they have received money from this kind of arts recovery scheme, right? And so I think this is, we shouldn't be stingy about kind of supporting these sectors going into 2021, right? So if we have to spend money, right, the time to spend that money is now. Sort of like, if you want to intervene in terms of stopping COVID, you want to kind of intervene early, right? So we want to support those organizations now and potentially kind of, to use a cliche, which I don't like to use, build them back stronger, right? Mm-hmm. And I suspect there's going to be this tallying up process as we go into 2021. And let's say we start to see balance sheet data come out from Companies House, and we're able to truly evaluate the condition of lots of firms and organizations, right? So I think it's currently estimated that there's sort of rates of about 7 to 10% of what you would think of as abuse of the furlough scheme, of like employers wrongly claiming too much furlough support, right? So I suspect what we're going to see is, some firms are going to come out of this COVID shock with potentially healthy balance sheets, right? And I'll be interested to see kind of how support of these sort of smaller arts organizations comes out as well, right? Because a lot of these organizations rely on kind of very small slivers of funding, and kind of schemes like the Arts Recovery Scheme could be a kind of a big long run help in the end.
We've got a question here from Matthew Smith, which I'll pop on the screen. So it says, thanks for the presentation. Will slides be published? Beyond a clearer headline, government strategy to the virus, what changes would you make to existing government support programs?
Okay, yeah, we'll put the slides up. We'll make it available through this website. What changes would I make to existing government support programs? I think it's too hard to say. I would agree with a lot of the work the Resolution Foundation has been putting out. So there's a bit, I didn't talk about self-employment, the self-employment scheme. So that so far seems to have been poorly targeted, right? So you're getting self-employed workers who are not suffering too much of an income shock, getting support from that scheme, yet other workers who've taken a big income shock but are ineligible for technical reasons, not getting any support, right? So that needs to be sort of reconfigured and kind of retargeted, which is easier said than done, right? I think the Treasury and all the related departments have done a good job of getting this money out into the economy pretty quickly. And then I think they need to start thinking hard about, okay, so we need to know, like, where does the government think we'll be in kind of spring 2021? What is the likelihood of a third lockdown? What is the likelihood of a lockdown that lasts from now until March? And we need to think about what sort of schemes are going to be in place for mid-2021 onwards, right? In terms of ongoing kind of higher levels of universal credit, and then ongoing support in terms of schemes like the Arts Recovery Scheme, or kind of the scheme for kind of small innovative firms, right? So essentially, like, what is this kind of phase 2 of pandemic Keynesianism going to look like, right, in terms of the scale of intervention, right? And you can come out on the side of, we want lots of intervention or less intervention. As a first thing, what I just want is some sort of clear signal of, what we're likely to see, right? That the government sort of makes decisions or sets some clear benchmarks of what is the path of government support in the future.
Okay. So you talked a lot about, your sort of the data, and it's incredible that you're getting some sort of up-to-date data, which is, obviously so useful. I'm curious, how can we make sure that that data is sort of, it gets to the right places, the right people get to see that data and it's being sort of followed. And that leads on to another question from Sylvia here in the audience as well. And she just says, is there any other data source that you would have liked to use but could not? And how can you predict job mobility?
Okay, so I think the ONS in particular has done an incredible job in terms of making data available and kind of collecting data during the pandemic, right? On the health side, like the sort of work they've been doing in terms of breaking up the deaths data, like on the health side is amazing. And then the sort of work that they've been doing on the economic side is great. The ONS can improve its website. I mean, I think a lot of people at the ONS will say that. That's one thing. In terms of other data sources that we'd like, it would be great to have faster, easier access to the direct admin data, right? So that sort of inflows and outflows data I showed, that sort of aggregated data released by the ONS and the HMRC. What would be really great is that there's kind of easier access for researchers to kind of dive in and directly access that data and decompose the flow of these inflows and outflows across different employers and different sectors and so on, right? And what we've had is sort of, in a lot of cases, access to administrative data has been reduced because the admin data labs have been closed, and there's soundly like a careful policy in terms of access to this confidential microdata, right? But I think there are some quick wins to be made there in terms of real-time monitoring of the economy and figuring out kind of where this shock is coming from, or where the shock is worst from, kind of just getting stuck into that administrative data.
Right. I think this will probably be our last question for the session, but the B word has finally been mentioned. What's the likely impact of Brexit on this picture?
Right. Geez. Okay. I would say I sort of have blocked. I'll have to say I blocked Brexit and I blocked Trump from my computer. I would expect, in terms of kind of monitoring what's going on, I'd expect Brexit doesn't help, right? And again, I'd say the priority that we've got is some sort of signal of what the kind of government wants here, right? The government to kind of make a decision about these negotiations, right? We've been going through this for 4 years. The uncertainty doesn't help. Kind of the economic consensus, the consensus amongst economists will be that kind of the Brexit process doesn't help overall. I think the consensus in terms of if you're pro or anti-Brexit would be, we want this kind of resolved soon, and that will kind of do a lot to help the economy.
Let's just squeeze one final question in. I think we've just got time. So how will COVID impact the workload available for jobs? Is it better to keep everyone employed but not really working, or is it better to allow for more redundancies? Will wage rigidity be influenced?
Okay. It's a tough one. Will they keep everyone employed but not really working? I expect, okay, so what I think at the moment in terms of evaluating that economist argument, right, is that we don't want to kind of let fly with these forces of creative destruction until we've had a reasonable stabilization of demand conditions, right? So, to some extent, you're going to have 3 million workers sitting on furlough until March, when the current scheme runs out. To some extent, that's, some of those will be kind of creatively destroyed at the end of furlough as kind of firms make their redundancy decisions. In that interim period up until March, we're effectively kind of looking at the same thing as if you just put them on some modified version of universal credit, or putting them on JRS. So I think it's best to keep them on the current scheme until we have a stabilization of demand conditions and the stabilization of the policy environment in terms of government suppression policy. I think to some extent, so this is something we're tracking, is we're trying to track the extent of the redundancies, including at the company level, to understand kind of how companies are making these redundancy decisions. It does look like, certain types of companies in certain sectors like hospitality, retail, and transport, in particular airlines, have started to make long-term decisions about kind of redundancies and kind of conditions once COVID has settled down, right? So I think, in short order, I think some of this process is occurring naturally in terms of this adjustment, with or without strong JRS support. Okay.
Excellent. Thank you very much. I think we'll draw to a close there, but that was fantastic. Thank you. I just want to flag up another event which we've got on tomorrow. I think it's tomorrow. Yes, Tuesday, 10th of November at 4 o'clock. So what matters more for recovery, innovation or entrepreneurship? So we've got a couple of speakers who will be debating quite lively whether they think innovation or entrepreneurship is going to be the bigger factor in terms of economic recovery from the pandemic. So you can find all the details of all our events on warwick.ac.uk/ESRC FOSS. But it just leaves me to say thank you again to Mirko, and thank you for all your questions and comments in the chat as well. And we'll probably see you soon during the week. Thank you.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.